Welcome to Hidden Dread. The Alaskan wilderness is beautiful, but it is not gentle. It does not welcome you, it tests you, and sometimes it swallows you whole. Deep in the heart of this frozen kingdom lies Denali National Park, 6 million acres of jagged peaks, ancient glacier, and endless pine forests. People travel from across the world to experience its untouched beauty, but few truly understand what it means to be alone out there, in a place where the wind screams across the ridges and the snow can bury a man in seconds. Two friends, Mark and Dylan, thought they did. They were not inexperienced hikers. Both had spent their childhoods exploring the backcountry of Montana, fishing in icy rivers, and camping under star-filled skies. Alaska was supposed to be their next great adventure. They packed their gear, mapped their trail, and promised themselves they would push further into the wild than most dared to go. It was late winter, the season when daylight was scarce and the night stretched long and merciless. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Yet the two men laughed as they hiked through the frozen forest, their breath steaming in the air, their boots crunching over packed snow. They believed the wilderness was theirs to conquer. By the time they set up camp, the light was fading fast. They pitched their tent in a small clearing, its canvas walls glowing orange against the dying firelight. The mighty shadow of Denali's Peak loomed in the distance, a silent reminder that they were only guests in this land. The night air was bitter. Every gust of wind cut like a knife. But inside the tent, wrapped in sleeping bags, the friends felt secure. The fire outside crackled and hissed, casting a warm glow that fought back the darkness. The only sounds were the occasional call of an owl and the distant howling of wolves. Hours passed, and sleep began to tug at their eyes. That's when it happened. Without warning, the fire outside snuffed out. One moment there was light, the next only shadows. The darkness closed in, heavy and suffocating. Dylan stirred first. Strange, he muttered. There was still wood left. Fires don't just die like that. Mark sat up, frowning. But before either man could think of what to do, they heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to press into the snow. They froze. No one else should be here. Their location was remote, miles away from the nearest ranger station. They had not seen another human being since the start of their trek. And yet, someone or something was moving outside their tent. The footsteps circled once, stopping directly behind them. The canvas rippled as though brushed by unseen fingers. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, stretching into unbearable tension. Then came the voice, a child's voice, fragile, thin, barely louder than the wind. "Can we come inside?" Mark and Dylan stared at each other. Neither spoke, neither breathed. The voice came again, clearer this time, right outside the tent flap. "Please, we're cold. Can we come in?" Every instinct in their bodies screamed that something was wrong. A child? Out here? In this wilderness? At this hour of night? It was impossible. No child could have survived out there alone. Against his better judgment, Mark reached for the zipper. Maybe someone's lost," he whispered. His fingers trembled as he pulled it down just enough to shine his flashlight through. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on two small figures standing in the snow. At first, they looked like children, a boy and a girl, no older than 10. They wore thin, ragged clothes, their bare feet blew against the icy ground. Their faces were pale, their lips cracked. It should have been a pitiful sight. But pity was the last thing Mark felt, because when the light caught their eyes, his heart nearly stopped. The children had no whites in their eyes, no irises, no pupils, only pits of pure black, endless voids that swallowed the beam of the flashlight. They stared back at him with those hollow eyes, unblinking, unhuman. Mark gasped and yanked the zipper shut. Dylan's voice cracked with fear. "What did you see?" Mark's voice shook. Not kids. Not kids." Outside, the voices came again, calm and flat, like a recording played on repeat. "Please, let us in. Please, we're so cold." The words should have been filled with desperation. Instead, they were emotionless. Wrong. The friends pressed their backs against the far wall of the tent, clutching their knives. The voices circled around them, moving from one side to the other. The sound of footsteps crunching the snow, never too close, never too far. Sometimes, the voices whispered just inches from the fabric. At one point, Dylan swore he saw the outline of a small hand pressing against the tent, its fingers stretching too long, too thin, before fading back into the dark. The night stretched endlessly. Neither man dared to move. Neither man dared to sleep. When the first faint glow of dawn crept across the horizon, the voices fell silent. The footsteps stopped. The clearing was still. Slowly, carefully, they opened the tent. The ground outside was smooth and untouched. No footprints. No children. No sign that anyone had been there at all. Mark and Dylan were pale with exhaustion, their hands shaking as they packed their gear. They didn't speak until they reached the ranger station hours later. When they finally recounted their story, expecting disbelief, the ranger only stared at them with weary eyes. "You're lucky," he said flatly. "Not everyone sees the morning after meeting them." He refused to explain further. But in nearby towns, whispers carried a name: the black-eyed children, entities that appeared as lost kids, begging to be let inside. They could not enter unless invited. And once invited, no one knew what happened, because no one had ever come back. Mark and Dylan never camped again. The wilderness had lost its magic. At night, in the silence of their homes, they sometimes swore they could hear it again. Soft footsteps, faint whispers outside their windows, and always the same words: "Please, let us in." Mark and Dylan left Denali the next morning, but the wilderness did not leave them. Even as they hiked back toward the ranger station, the weight of the night pressed down on their shoulders. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crunch of their boots on frozen earth. They didn't talk about what they'd seen. They didn't dare. By the time they reached the ranger cabin, exhaustion painted their faces pale and hollow. The ranger poured them coffee, the steam curling into the bitter morning air. Mark tried to explain what had happened, his voice trembling with each detail. The voices, the children, the eyes like bottomless pits. The ranger didn't laugh. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he leaned back, folded his arms, and said softly, "You should be grateful you didn't let them in." Dylan leaned forward. "What are they?" The ranger shook his head. "You don't want to know." Then he muttered something under his breath, words neither of them recognized, perhaps an old native prayer. They left that day, but the ranger's words dug into their minds like hooks. "You should be grateful." That phrase replayed in their thoughts over and over. What would have happened if they had let the children in? What would those black eyes have done once inside the safety of the tent? The first night back home, weeks later, Mark lay in his own bed, far away from Alaska, far from the frozen wilderness. He should have felt safe. But at 2 a.m., he woke suddenly, his skin clammy with sweat. At first, he thought it was just a nightmare. The same dream again, the children circling the tent, whispering in flat voices. But this time, the whisper wasn't in his dream. It was outside. "Please, let us in." His blood turned to ice. Slowly, he sat up, straining his ears. The whisper came again, clearer, closer, as if just outside the window. Mark stumbled to the glass, pulling back the curtain with shaking fingers. The yard was empty. The night was still. But he swore, just at the corner of the property where the streetlight didn't reach, he saw movement. 2 small shapes standing perfectly still. Watching, he slammed the curtain shut, heart racing. For the rest of the night, he sat awake, clutching a kitchen knife, the whisper replaying in his mind until dawn. The next morning, he convinced himself it was exhaustion, stress, nothing more. But deep down, he knew the truth. The children had followed him. Dylan's confession. Weeks later, Mark got a call from Dylan. His friend's voice was hoarse, cracking like old wood. "Mark, they came here too." Dylan described waking in the middle of the night to the sound of his door handle jiggling. At first, he thought it was a burglar, but then came the voices, 2 children begging to be let inside. When he peered through the peephole, there they were, the boy and the girl, pale, ragged, their black eyes locked onto his. He had turned off all the lights, hid in the bathroom, and prayed until sunrise. When he finally checked again, the porch was empty, but on the door frame, scratched deep into the wood, was a single word: "Soon." Mark's chest tightened as Dylan told him this. They had left Alaska, but Alaska had not left them. The wilderness had branded them. The children were not bound by mountains or rivers or snow. They were bound to their victims, searching for answers. Desperate, Mark began researching. He scoured online forums, libraries, and local folklore. To his shock, he found countless accounts of the black-eyed children, report from all across the world, stretching back decades. People who had seen them knocking at doors, standing on porches, or waiting outside cars at night, always asking to be let inside, always polite, always terrifying. The stories all carried the same warning. Once you let them in, you vanish. No trace, no body, only whispers in the night where you once lived. Some believed they were demons, wearing the guise of children to disarm their victims. Others believed they were extraterrestrial, scouts sent to harvest souls. A few even claimed they were spirits of the dead, cursed to wander until they tricked the living into joining them. Mark found one story that chilled him most of all. In 1998, a man in Vermont reported letting 2 such children into his home during a snowstorm. Hours later, his neighbors found the house empty. The man's belongings were untouched, the fire still burning in the fireplace. But the man himself and his entire family were gone. Their pets, too. The only sign left behind was small, barefoot prints in the snow, leading away from the house, vanishing into the woods. The report was buried, dismissed as rumor. But Mark knew better. The pieces all fit. He and Dylan had stumbled into a legend that was not just legend, it was real, and now it was following them. A plan to escape. One evening, after another sleepless night of whispers outside his window, Mark drove to Dylan's house. The 2 men sat in silence, their faces haggard, their eyes bloodshot. "We can't live like this," Dylan said finally. "We have to fight back. Oh, or get rid of them somehow." "But how do you fight something not of this world? Guns? Knives? Holy water?" Nothing seemed certain. They reached out to a local elder from a native Alaskan community, a man Dylan knew through a friend. Over the phone, they told him their story. There was a long silence. Then the elder spoke. "You have been marked. Once they show themselves to you, they will not leave. They are not children. They are not even alive as you know it. They are something else, something older. You must resist. No matter what happens, never let them in." The elder gave them a ritual of protection, a circle of salt, sage smoke, prayers to keep the entities at bay. Mark and Dylan tried everything. They burned sage through their homes. They drew protective symbols on their doors. They sprinkled salt across the thresholds. For a while, the whispers faded. Nights passed in uneasy peace. But peace never lasts. The return. One night, Mark woke again at 3 a.m. The air was heavy, suffocating. His room smelled faintly of sulfur. And then came the sound, the soft tapping on his window. Tap, tap, tap. He froze, clutching the covers. Slowly, the tapping turned into scratching, long nails dragging across the glass. Then came the whisper, closer than ever before. "Please, let us in." He dared to look, just once. Outside his second-story window, pressed against the glass, were two faces. The boy, the girl, their skin stretched tight, their black eyes unblinking, their smiles too wide. And Mark realized something that turned his stomach cold. They weren't asking permission anymore. They were warning him. Mark hadn't slept properly in weeks. His nights were filled with whispers, scratching, and fleeting shadows outside his home. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those faces, pale, hollow, with black eyes that devoured the light. Dylan was no better. His voice on the phone grew weaker, more frantic. "They're getting stronger," he whispered one night. "They don't wait outside anymore. I see them in the mirrors, in my dreams. Sometimes I wake up and they are standing in my room, just watching." Mark gripped the phone, heart pounding. "Don't let them in." But Dylan's reply chilled him. "What if I already did?" The final visit. It was a stormy night when everything came to a head. Wind howled against Mark's house, rattling the shutters. Rain streaked down the windows in angry rivers. He sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight, waiting for the inevitable. And then, knocking, 3 sharp raps at the front door. He didn't move. His breath caught in his throat. The knocking came again, softer this time. Then the voices. "Please, we're cold. Let us in." He shut his eyes tight, praying silently. But the voices didn't stop. They multiplied, overlapping, echoing through the walls. They came from the front door, the windows, the back door. The whispers crawled across the house like spiders. "Please, let us in. Please, please, please." And then, the sound of glass shattering. Mark's eyes snapped open. His living room window had cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across it. A small hand pressed against a broken glass, its fingers pale, too long, too sharp. The protection circles, the sage, the salt, it was all useless now. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. Dylan's silence. Mark tried calling Dylan, desperate for reassurance. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. Silence. No voice. No breath. But faintly, in the background, he heard it. Children's laughter. Cold, empty, endless. The line went dead. The next day, Mark drove to Dylan's house. The front door was unlocked, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the house was spotless. Too spotless. Plates neatly stacked, furniture perfectly in place. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No broken glass. But Dylan was gone. His clothes remained in the closet. His shoes sat by the door. His wallet, his phone, even half a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, all left behind. It was as if Dylan had simply walked away from his life, all being erased. On the living room table lay one thing, a single sheet of paper. In shaky handwriting, it read, "I couldn't keep them out." The last stand. That night, Mark locked every door, every window. He turned on every light. He armed himself with knives, crosses, prayers, anything he could think of. But as the clock struck midnight, the power died. The lights went out. The house plunged into darkness. The whispers began. "Please, let us in." Mark backed into his bedroom, flashlight trembling in his grip. He aimed it at the door. Shadows moved beneath it, small feet pacing back and forth. The handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. A voice spoke, clearer than ever, right outside. "You've seen us. You belong to us now." The doorknob twisted. The wood creaked. The door shuddered under invisible force. And then, suddenly, silence. The house was still. The whispers were gone. Hours passed, and nothing came. As dawn broke, sunlight poured through the windows, bathing the house in gold. Mark collapsed on the floor, exhausted but alive. He thought maybe he had survived. Maybe he had resisted long enough. But then he saw it. On the inside of his bedroom door, carved deep into the wood by something sharp, were 3 words. "Next time, yes." Epilogue. The endless knock. Mark vanished 2 weeks later. Neighbors reported hearing children's voices outside his home the night he disappeared. They thought it odd. Mark lived alone, and no children lived nearby. By morning, his front door was wide open, his belongings untouched. He was never seen again. Some say he joined Dylan. Others say he became one of them, his soul absorbed into the darkness behind those black eyes. And still, travelers in Denali whisper about the children. Campers swear they hear soft knocks on their tents, faint voices in the howling wind. "Please, let us in." And those who answer, they are never seen again. The icy waters of Alaska's southeastern coast have always been both a source of life and a place of death. Fishermen and hunters brave the mist-covered inlets and fjords, but among the Tlingit people, whispers have passed down for centuries about a predator unlike any other, a creature called the Kushtaka. To outsiders, it's dismissed as folklore. To locals, it's a warning. The Kushtaka is said to be a shapeshifter, able to take the form of a familiar person or even an innocent child in distress. Its goal is simple: lure its victim toward the water and drag them to a fate worse than drowning. The missing fisherman. In 2011, a commercial fisherman named Harold set out from his small coastal village with a group of men to hunt crab. The work was grueling, and the sea was merciless, but Harold had been at it his whole life. He knew the tides, the storms, the currents. When the weather turned suddenly violent one evening, the men decided to make camp on a narrow strip of rocky beach. The rain hammered down, the fog rolled thick across the water, and the howling wind carried with it strange echoes, like voices, faint but persistent. At first, Harold thought it was a wind through the cliffs, but then he heard it clearly, the sound of a child crying. He froze, his heart lurching. A child? Out here, miles from the nearest village, in the middle of a storm? Impossible. Yet the sound was unmistakable, sobbing, desperate, cutting through the night air. Grabbing his flashlight, Harold moved toward the tree line. His crewmates warned him not to wander, but Harold insisted. "There's a kid out there," he shouted over the storm. "I can't just leave them." The others stayed behind, muttering prayers. They knew the stories. Harold did not. The encounter. As Harold pushed through the dripping foliage, the cries grew louder. "Help me! Please, help!" He followed the voice deeper into the woods until his light caught on a figure, small, shivering, huddled against a tree. It was a boy, no older than 10, soaked to the bone, clutching his knees. Harold knelt, trying to coax him forward. "It's okay, kid. I've got you. Let's get you warmed up." The boy lifted his head slowly. His eyes glowed faintly in the beam of the flashlight, not with reflection, but with something unnatural. And when he opened his mouth, the voice that came out was not that of a child, but a guttural, distorted growl. "You shouldn't have come." The figure blurred, shifted, twisted. Flesh rippled like water. The boy's form elongated, his jaw stretching into something animalistic, his hands curling into claws. Harold staggered back as before him stood not a boy, but a nightmare, tall, hunched, with patches of slick, matted fur, a mouth too wide filled with jagged teeth, and eyes that burned with hunger. The Kushtaka, the last sight of Harold. The crew waiting on the beach later reported hearing Harold scream. It echoed through the storm, sharp and short, then cut off abruptly. One of the men swore he saw something moving between the trees, something large, something dragging another figure into the darkness. They did not go after him. They didn't dare. By morning, the storm had cleared, but Harold was gone. All they found were his boots on the shoreline, half buried in the sand, and a trail of wet footprints leading into the forest. Oddly, some of the prints were Harold's. Others looked like otter tracks, but the tracks didn't lead back out. The legend spreads. Word of Harold's disappearance spread quickly. Some said he drowned, swept away by the storm. But among the locals, there was no doubt Harold had been claimed by the Kushtaka. According to the Tlingit, the Kushtaka are otter-like demons, creatures that live between the realms of land and water. They lure victims by mimicking the voices of loved ones or the cries of children. Once you follow them, there is no escape. Some say they kill you swiftly, tearing you apart on the riverbanks. Others say they drag your soul into their realm, twisting you into one of their own. And perhaps the most terrifying part of the legend, those who encounter a Kushtaka and survive are never the same. They are cursed, haunted by strange dreams, plagued by whispers in the night, always feeling watched. Harold's crewmates never went back to that inlet again. To this day, local fishermen avoid it, calling it the Cursed Beach. Even tourists who wander too close have reported strange cries in the mist, voices calling them by name, leading them toward the water. The disappearance of Harold left a scar on the small fishing community. His family held a funeral with no body, His crew swore never to return to that cursed inlet, and the locals shook their heads knowingly. They said Harold had been taken by the Kushtaka, and once they choose someone, there's no escape. But Harold's story was not the only one. Over the decades, dozens of others have vanished under equally mysterious circumstances, each case carrying the same chilling detail. Strange voices in the fog, or cries for help that drew people to the water's edge. One of the most chilling cases came from a park ranger named Emily, who worked along the inside passage. She wasn't a superstitious woman, but she would come to learn that not every legend is just a story. Emily's patrol. In 2015, Emily was stationed near a remote stretch of forest known for its endless fog. Her job was simple: patrol the trails, check campsites, and ensure tourists didn't wander too far off marked paths. On one of her late evening patrols, she heard something that froze her in place, the faint sound of a man calling out for help. "Somebody, please." At first, she thought it might be a hiker in trouble. Injuries and accidents weren't uncommon, and Emily had trained for these emergencies. She called back, announcing herself as a ranger, but the voice only grew fainter as her retreating deeper into the mist. She followed, flashlight cutting through the swirling gray. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling branches smothered by the fog. The air grew colder, damp against her skin. Then she heard it again, closer this time. "Emily, help me." Her heart skipped. Whoever it was knew her name. The face in the fog. Emily quickened her pace until she reached a clearing. The mist swirled like smoke, and there in the center stood a man. He was drenched, his clothes torn, his skin pale. It was Harold. Emily had never met him in life, but she recognized his face from a photograph that still hung in the village's fishing docks, a memorial to the man who vanished years earlier. He stood trembling, his eyes wide, his lips blue. "Please," he begged, his voice weak, broken. "They are coming. Help me." Emily raised her radio, calling for backup. Static answered. She took a cautious step forward, her instincts warring against reason. How could Harold be standing there, alive, when he'd been declared dead years ago? She shined her flashlight on him, and for a brief moment she saw the truth. His reflection in the beam didn't match. His shadow moved against the light, stretching unnaturally. His face flickered, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Then his mouth widened, far too wide, stretching into a smile filled with jagged, glistening teeth. His voice shifted, deep and animalistic. "You came." The chase. The figure lunged. Emily bolted, crashing through the trees, branches whipping her face. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it, the heavy, wet slaps of something inhuman chasing her. The sound was wrong, like a blend of bare feet and claws. The forest seemed endless, the fog swallowing her path. Panic clawed at her lungs as she stumbled through mud and roots. She could hear it behind her, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always circling. At one point, she thought she saw an exit, the faint glow of her ranger cabin lights. Relief surged through her, but when she burst into the clearing, she froze. The cabin was gone. In its place stood a wall of water, dark and rippling, as if the forest itself had given way to a lake. And standing at its edge were three figures. Children. They waved at her, their voices sweet and soft. "Emily, come with us." Her flashlight trembled in her grip. The children's faces were wrong, their smiles too wide, their eyes glowing faintly like animal eyes in the dark. Behind them, The water churned, and something vast moved just beneath the surface. Emily backed away, muttering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Escape. She didn't remember how she got out. One moment, she was standing at the edge of the water, the children beckoning her closer. The next, she was sprinting blindly through the fog, her legs moving without thought. When she finally stumbled into her cabin, gasping for breath, the fog outside had cleared. The forest looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. Her radio crackled to life. A voice asked if she was safe. She couldn't bring herself to answer. Later, when she checked the clearing again with a team of rangers, there was no lake, no children, no tracks. But on a tree near where she had stopped, someone, or something, had carved a single word into the bark: mine. Emily never worked another night patrol after that. She transferred stations within a month. But even in the city, she swore she sometimes heard voices in the fog, calling her name. The Kushtaka's nature. What makes the Kushtaka more terrifying than many other legends is its cunning. Unlike a mindless predator, it chooses its form carefully. Sometimes a child, sometimes a loved one, sometimes the lost themselves. It preys not on weakness, but on compassion, using our instinct to help against us. Those who follow the voices rarely return, and those who do are forever changed. They see things in the corner of their vision. They hear their names whispered in silence. They dream of water closing over their heads, pulling them into a world they cannot escape. The story of Harold's disappearance and Emily's haunting encounter might seem like isolated events, but in truth, they are part of a much larger pattern. The Kushtaka has stalked Alaska for centuries, woven into both ancient legend and modern terror. But its true horror lies not in one victim, or two, but in its endless hunger, always waiting, always watching, always near water. The miner's tale. In the early 1900s, when the gold rush lured thousands into Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, a prospector named George disappeared near the Chilkat River. Fellow miners claimed he had gone out to fetch water at dusk, but never returned. At first, they thought he had slipped into the current. But later that night, George returned, dripping wet, pale, silent. He walked into camp and sat by the fire without a word. When his friends asked where he had gone, he simply smiled, but something in his face was wrong. His eyes gleamed strangely in the firelight, his jaw shifting unnaturally, as if the bones themselves had rearranged. One of the men reached to touch him, and in an instant, George let out a guttural snarl. His face split open wider than humanly possible, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The men fled in terror, abandoning the camp. By morning, nothing remained but scattered gear, overturned pans, and bloody footprints leading toward the river. George and the others were never seen again. Locals said George had been claimed by the Kushtaka, twisted into one of its own. That was why the others vanished. Once touched by the creature, you are never truly yourself again. The fisherman's return. In 1974, a commercial fisherman named Albert vanished during a solo trip. Search parties scoured the shoreline but found no trace. Weeks later, Albert walked into his own home in the village, calm as ever, as though nothing had happened. But his wife noticed strange details. His clothes were damp, though the day was dry. His speech was flat, mechanical, like he was repeating someone else's words. At night, he would rise and stand silently by the window, staring out toward the sea for hours. The final straw came when their young daughter screamed one morning. She claimed her father's face had melted when he kissed her goodnight, stretching like liquid before snapping back to normal. When Albert's wife confronted him, he only smiled. "Don't worry," he whispered, voice guttural. "You'll understand soon." The next morning, Albert and his family were gone. Their house stood empty, dinner still warm on the table. Neighbors who searched found nothing but otter tracks circling the home. The ritual of protection. Among the Tlingit people, stories of the Kushtaka always come with warnings. Elders said the creature fears certain things: copper, fire, and dogs. Hunters would carry copper knives or wear copper charms to ward off the shapeshifters. Dogs, it was said, could sense their true form and would bark furiously when one was near. But the greatest protection was resistance. No matter what voice you hear, no matter what face you see, you must not follow. You must not help. The Kushtaka cannot drag you into the water unless you walk willingly toward it. And yet, that is the true horror. In a land as unforgiving as Alaska, compassion is instinct. If you hear a child screaming, you run to help. If you see a loved one drowning, you rush to save them. The Kushtaka knows this. It uses humanity against itself. The final story, the tourists. In 2018, 2 tourists from the lower 48 went missing while kayaking near misty fjords. Authorities later found their kayaks drifting, gear intact, but no bodies. At first, it was ruled an accident, but a local boat captain told another version. He claimed he had seen the pair that evening from a distance, their kayaks gliding smoothly through the mist. He called out, warning them of rough currents, but they did not reply. Instead, they both turned their heads toward him at the same time, their movements eerily synchronized. For a moment, the captain thought their faces looked wrong, elongated, blurred, like water distorting an image. He turned his boat away, unwilling to get closer. When the fog cleared, the kayaks were empty. Weeks later, hikers reported seeing 2 figures standing silently by the shoreline of a nearby cove. A man and a woman, both dripping wet, both smiling too widely. When the hikers called out, the figures vanished into the trees, leaving only wet footprints behind. The endless hunger. What makes the Kushtaka so terrifying is not just its power, but its persistence. Once it chooses you, it does not stop. You may flee across rivers, mountains, even oceans, but the whispers will follow. The faces will return. And if it does not claim you directly, it may take you another way, through those you love. It might wear the face of your child, your spouse, your friend. And when you realize too late that it isn't them, you are already in its grasp. Some say the Kushtaka does not kill in the traditional sense. Instead, it transforms. It bends your soul into its image, pulling you into its ranks. This is why sightings are endless and the legends never die, because every victim becomes another Kushtaka, forever luring more prey into the water. Epilogue: the waters whisper. Today, boaters along Alaska's foggy inlet still whisper warnings. They tell newcomers not to follow voices in the mist. They tell them not to trust the cries of children near water. They tell them to carry copper, to travel with dogs, and never to go alone. But still, the disappearances continue. People vanish into the fog, their belongings left behind, their bodies never found. And on still nights, when the sea is quiet, some swear they hear voices drifting over the water, calling their names. If you ever find yourself by an Alaskan river or fjord, and you hear someone you know calling for help, remember this. Sometimes compassion is a trap. Sometimes the one you love is no longer who they seem. And if you see a figure in the mist, smiling with teeth too sharp and eyes too bright. Run. Because once the Kushtaka chooses you, the water will claim you. The Alaskan wilderness is unforgiving. Endless tundra, bitter winds, and temperatures that can freeze flesh in minutes. Survival here demands resilience, but in the most desperate winters, survival has bred something darker, an ancient terror known as a Wendigo. Though often associated with Algonquin legend in the northern forests of Canada and the Great Lakes, whispers of the Wendigo seeped into Alaskan folklore during the harshest years of famine and isolation. Hunters spoke of a monstrous spirit of insatiable hunger, born from starvation and cannibalism, cursed to roam the frozen wastes. And in 1922, a trapper named Samuel came face to face with the creature. The isolated cabin. Samuel was no stranger to loneliness. He lived in a small cabin miles from the nearest town, trapping fox and lynx to sell their pelts. Winter was his ally, but also his greatest enemy. That year, the snow came early and hard. By December, he was already running low on food. Still, he believed he could endure. He'd survived worse. But one night, as a blizzard howled outside, Samuel awoke to a sound that chilled his blood, the crunch of footsteps circling his cabin. At first, he thought it was a wolf, maybe a bear, but the steps were too slow, too deliberate. They moved with a strange rhythm, dragging through the snow. Then came the sound of breathing, deep, ragged, guttural. Something was standing just outside his door. Samuel gripped his rifle, heart hammering. The breathing grew louder, closer, and then silence. Minutes stretched like hours. When he finally dared to peek through a crack in the shutter, he saw it. The face at the window. A gaunt face peered back at him, sunken eyes glowing faintly yellow, skin stretched thin over bone, lips torn and bleeding. The thing's mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth and a black tongue. Its breath fogged the glass. Samuel stumbled back, slamming the shutter shut. His heart thundered in his chest. The stories were true. The Wendigo was real. For hours, the creature stalked his cabin, scratching at the walls with long, bony claws. Sometimes it whispered in a voice that was almost human, calling Samuel's name. Other times, it wailed like the wind itself, mournful and hungry. Samuel prayed for dawn. But when the sun rose, the Wendigo was still there, lurking at the edge of the trees, its skeletal frame hunched and twitching. The hunter becomes a hunted. Days turned into nights, and the Wendigo never left. It circled the cabin relentlessly, sometimes disappearing into the blizzard, only to return hours later with that same scratching, that same whisper. Samuel's food dwindled. He rationed what little he had left, but hunger gnawed at him, just as it gnawed at the creature outside. One night, delirious with exhaustion, Samuel thought he heard his mother's voice calling him from the woods. He nearly opened the door, hand trembling on the latch, when he caught a glimpse of movement in the window. The Wendigo was grinning, its teeth glistening in the moonlight. It had mimicked her voice. Samuel realized with horror that it wasn't just hungry for flesh, it was hungry for him, body and soul. The tracks in the snow. On the 6th day, Samuel decided he couldn't wait any longer. If he stayed, he would starve. If he left, the Wendigo would follow. But maybe, just maybe, he could outwit it. At dawn, he gathered his supplies, slung his rifle across his back, and slipped out the back door. The snow was knee-deep, every step a struggle. He forced himself onward, leaving false trails to confuse his pursuit. For hours, He trudged through the tundra, his breath burning in his chest, until finally he reached the frozen river. But when he looked back, his stomach dropped. There, in his tracks, stood the Wendigo. Its long limbs carried it easily across the snow, its movements jerky yet unnaturally fast. It raised its head, and with a voice that was almost human, it screamed his name. The sound carried across the tundra like a death knell. Samuel ran. The frozen lake. By nightfall, Samuel reached the lake, its surface a sheet of ice. He staggered across, praying it would hold his weight. Behind him, the Wendigo followed, its claws scraping against the frozen surface, its reflection a twisted shadow in the ice. Halfway across, Samuel stopped. He turned, raising his rifle. His hand shook, but he aimed at the monster's chest and fired. The bullet struck true, but the Wendigo barely flinched. It threw its head back and laughed, a sound that made Samuel's blood run cold. The ice beneath them groaned, cracking under the weight of their battle. And as the Wendigo advanced, Samuel realized the truth. Bullets could not kill hunger, the first vanishing. When Samuel's brother came searching weeks later, he found the cabin empty. The door was broken, the windows shattered. Inside, the walls were scratched with deep gouges, as though claws had torn through wood. Samuel's rifle lay on the floor, bent and broken. His belongings were scattered, untouched by thieves. But Samuel himself was gone. On the frozen lake, the snow told a story. Samuel's boot prints led halfway across, then stopped. No blood, no body, no return tracks. Only claw marks gouged into the ice, leading back into the woods. The Wendigo had claimed another victim. Samuel's disappearance should have been the end of the story, another lonely trapper lost to the Alaskan winter. But the Wendigo does not vanish with one victim. Hunger is endless. It spreads. It infects. And sometimes it devours not just a man, but an entire community. The winter of famine. In the winter of 1923, the village of Kogmiut, tucked deep in Alaska's interior, faced a famine unlike any in memory. The caribou had not migrated through that year. The fish nets came up empty, and the storehouse that should have carried the community through the long months of cold was nearly barren by December. Families huddled together in their sod houses, burning the last of their firewood, whispering prayers that spring would come quickly. But as the weeks dragged on, the children grew thinner, the elders weaker. And then the sightings began. Hunters reported seeing a tall, skeletal figure stalking the tree line. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, watching the village. At night, people heard scratching at their doors, followed by voices that mimicked loved ones. At first, they dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by hunger and fear. But soon, the tracks in the snow proved otherwise. Enormous prints, too long, too narrow, with clawed toes, circled the village. The Wendigo had come. The first disappearance. The first to vanish was a boy named Onik. His mother awoke in the middle of the night to hear him crying outside their home. She rushed to the door, only to find the yard empty, snow falling softly. In the morning, his tracks led out toward the forest, where they abruptly stopped. At the end of the trail, hunters found scraps of cloth and strange, gouged claw marks in the trees. The elders told the people to stay indoors after dark, to ignore the voices they heard, no matter how familiar. But hunger makes people desperate, and desperation makes them careless. Within a week, 3 more villages were gone. The elders' warning. Desperate for answers, the village gathered in the largest sod house, where the eldest woman, Nanaluk, told them the truth. The Wendigo comes in times of famine, she said, her voice trembling. It is a spirit of greed, of hunger that cannot be satisfied. It was once a man, but it consumed human flesh, and for this it was cursed. Now it roams, feeding, growing stronger with every soul it devours. The villagers listened in silence, fear etched in every face. Nanaluk told them that the only way to fight it was to resist, to never heed its calls, to never let hunger drive them to madness. But as the weeks dragged on, resistance grew harder. The Wendigo was patient, and hunger eats away not just at the body, but at the mind. The hunters attempt. In late January, 4 hunters armed themselves with rifles, spears, and charms of copper and set out to track the Wendigo. They followed its prints deep into the woods, through snowdrifts and frozen rivers, until at last they found a clearing. In the center stood a towering figure, skeletal, emaciated, its ribs visible beneath stretched, grayish skin. Its eyes burned like embers, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth. The hunters raised their weapons, but the creature moved with impossible speed. It leapt across the clearing, tearing one man apart in seconds. Another fired his rifle, but the bullet passed through the Wendigo as though striking smoke. Only 2 hunters returned, screaming of a nightmare they could not kill. Their friend's body was never found, only scraps of bone, gnawed clean. The madness spreads. As the famine worsened, some villagers began whispering about cannibalism. They spoke of neighbors who had died, of meat that could sustain their families just a little longer. The elders forbade it, warning that such acts would only feed the Wendigo, make it stronger. But hunger twists the mind. One night, a man named Kunik was caught butchering the body of his own cousin, who had frozen to death the day before. The villagers dragged him into the snow, horrified, demanding justice. But before they could decide his fate, a shadow fell across the gathering. The Wendigo had come for him. It descended upon Kunik with claws and teeth, dragging him screaming into the darkness. The villagers scattered in terror. In the snow where he had fallen, they found only blood, steaming in the cold. From that night on, the Wendigo prowled boldly through the village itself. The Great Fire, Nanaluk, the elder, told the people there was only one hope left: fire. The Wendigo feared it as it feared copper. If they could lure it close enough, they might drive it away. The villagers gathered what little fuel remained, piling wood, oil, and cloth into a massive pyre at the center of the village. They waited through the night, shivering, clutching torches. The Wendigo came at dawn. It stalked into the clearing, taller than the tallest man, its limbs impossibly long. It smiled with cracked lips, its teeth dripping with blood. Then it spoke, in the voices of the missing children, the lost hunters, even Kunik. "Help me," it begged in a dozen tones at once. "I'm so cold. I'm so hungry. Let me in." But the villagers did not move. When it stepped into the circle of firelight, Nanaluk shouted, and the torches were thrown. The pyre roared to life, flames crackling into the sky. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound so inhuman that it rattled the bones of all who heard it. It staggered back, its flesh blistering in the heat, smoke pouring from its mouth. And then, with a howl that split the dawn, it fled into the forest. The hollow victory. For a time, the village believed they had won. The attack stopped, the voices ceased, and though hunger still clawed at their bellies, the people began to hope that spring would come before the Wendigo returned. But the victory was hollow. Half the village had already perished from famine. The rest were broken with fear. And deep in the forest, beyond the reach of the fire, the Wendigo still waited. It was burned, but not destroyed, because hunger can never truly die. Generations passed. The famine that destroyed Cogmiat faded into history, remembered only in whispers among elders and in fragments of folklore. Outsiders dismiss the stories as superstition, exaggerated tales of desperation. But the Wendigo is patient. Its hunger does not vanish with the turning of seasons or the birth of new centuries. It waits, quiet, hidden, until the cold once again makes people weak. And in 1978, it returned, not to a starving village, but to a modern research station in the heart of the tundra, the Aurora Station. Aurora Station was built as part of a climatology project, staffed by 8 researchers who studied snowpack, winds, and magnetic disturbances caused by the Aurora Borealis. The work was dull but important, and the isolation was considered manageable. After all, the station had electricity, radio contact, and supplies to last a winter. But by late February, the storms became relentless. Whiteouts lasted days. Supplies dwindled faster than expected, and that was when the sightings began. At first, it was only Dr. Peters, the station leader, who reported seeing something tall moving on the horizon. A trick of the light, he thought. A shadow cast by the aurora. But soon, others saw it too, a gaunt figure at the edge of camp, watching. Its glowing eyes reflected against the snow like lanterns, the voices in the wind. One night, as the team gathered for dinner, the radio crackled to life. Through the static came a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help, please, so cold." It was the voice of Karen, one of their colleagues who had gone missing in a storm the week before. The team froze. They had searched for her for 2 days before giving up, convinced she was dead. Now, here she was, calling through the radio. Dr. Peters rushed to respond, but the others stopped him. "It's not her," whispered Dr. Lee, her hands trembling. "It's trying to trick us." The voice continued, growing more desperate. "Please, I can see the lights of the station. Let me in." Moments later, a knock echoed at the door. The team sat in silence, staring, their breath fogging in the cold air. Slowly, the knock grew louder, more frantic, until it became a pounding. Finally, Dr. Peters cracked. He grabbed his coat, declaring he wouldn't let a colleague freeze to death. He opened the door. There was nothing outside, only snow swirling in the wind. But the pounding didn't stop. It was coming from inside the walls. The first death. The next morning, they found Peters dead. His body was pale, twisted, his eyes wide with terror. No wounds, no blood, just a look of someone who had seen something no human should. His tracks led outside, halfway to the tree line, then vanished. That night, the Wendigo returned. They saw it clearly this time, a skeletal silhouette taller than the station roof, its claws dragging through the snow. It moved with jerky, unnatural strides, stopping only to tilt its head at impossible angles, as though listening to their very heartbeats. The team barricaded the doors, clutched their copper instruments, and prayed the creature would pass. But the Wendigo does not pass. Hunger never leaves. The descent into madness. Days turned into a blur. Sleep became impossible. Each night, the Wendigo circled the station, scratching at the walls, whispering in the voices of the dead. Sometimes it was Peters. Sometimes it was Karen. Sometimes it was family members no one had spoken of in years. The whispers gnawed at their sanity. Dr. Lee stopped eating, convinced that food was poisoned. Another researcher, Tom, began speaking to shadows in the corners of the room, claiming they were trying to warn him. On the 12th night, Tom broke. He walked into the storm barefoot, laughing hysterically. The others tried to stop him, but the wind swallowed him whole. Through the windows, they saw him collapse in the snow, and something enormous crouched over him, feeding. The last transmission. By March, only 3 researchers remained. Their final radio transmission, intercepted by a nearby station, was garbled, filled with static, but a few words were clear. It's inside now. Walls are breathing. Eyes in the dark. Hunger, hunger, hunger. Then silence. When rescuers finally reached Aurora Station weeks later, they found the building abandoned. The walls were clawed, furniture overturned. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, circles and spirals burned into the floor. No bodies were ever recovered. Only scraps of clothing, gnawed and torn. Outside the station, claw marks led into the tundra, and in the snow, a single word was etched as though by a trembling hand: hungry. The Wendigo today. Even now, pilots and truckers crossing the Alaskan tundra tell stories of seeing a gaunt figure in the distance, standing motionless against the horizon. Some say they hear voices carried on the wind, familiar voices calling their names. Others tell of feeling watched when alone in the snow, of seeing glowing eyes reflected in the darkness, of hearing footsteps behind them that vanish when they turn. And every year, people go missing. Their bodies never found, their names whispered only in warning, because the Wendigo never dies. It waits, patient and endless, feeding on hunger, on fear, on the human weakness that surfaces when survival is at stake. Epilogue. The hunger spreads. The legend says that once you've seen the Wendigo, it mocks you. It follows, slowly, across years, across miles, until at last it claims you. And when it does, you don't just die, you become it. Another soul added to the endless army of hunger. So if you ever find yourself alone on the tundra, starving, desperate, and you hear a voice calling from the storm, don't listen. Don't follow. Don't open the door. Because once a Wendigo chooses you, there is no escape. And in Alaska's frozen heart, the hunger never ends. The Yukon is vast, cold, and lonely. Its forests stretch endlessly. Its nights last longer than anywhere else in North America. For those who live in remote cabins or drive the endless highways, isolation becomes a way of life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, isolation is broken by an unexpected sound, a knock at the door. And sometimes, the ones knocking are not human. The phenomenon of the black-eyed children has been reported across the world. But in the Yukon, their appearances take on a chilling, snowbound edge. They appear suddenly on lonely roads or at the doors of isolated homes, always at night, always asking to be let inside. Their skin is pale, their voices calm, but their eyes, completely black, without white, without pupils, betray their true nature. In 1996, trucker Michael Harding came face to face with them on a desolate stretch of the Alaska Highway, the road through nothingness. Michael had been driving long haul for years, hauling supplies between Whitehorse and Fairbanks. He was used to solitude, used to endless miles of nothing but trees, snow, and sky. But that night, the cold was brutal. His heater struggled against the -40 chill, first creeping across the inside of his windshield. The road was empty, silent, except for the crunch of his tires. It was close to 2 a.m. when he saw them. 2 children standing at the side of the highway. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks. No children should be out here, a mile from the nearest town. He slowed, headlights sweeping across them. A boy and a girl, maybe 10 years old, dressed in thin clothing unsuited for the freezing night. They didn't wave. They didn't move. They just stood, staring. Michael pulled over, rolling down his window. "You kids okay?" he called out. That was when he saw their eyes. The eyes that shouldn't exist. The boy stepped closer, into the beam of the headlights. His skin was pale, almost gray, lips blue from cold. But it was his eyes that froze Michael's blood. They were solid black, not just the pupils, everything. Black like ink, black like the void of the sky itself. Michael's first thought was some kind of injury, some rare condition. But then the girl stepped forward, and her eyes were the same. "Please," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "We're cold. We need a ride." Michael's instinct screamed at him to drive, to leave them standing there. But another part of him, the human part, hesitated. They looked like children. They sounded like children. And the Yukon was merciless to the lost. Still, something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The truck ride. Against his better judgment, Michael unlocked the passenger door. The 2 climbed in silently, sitting side by side. At once, the air in the cab grew colder, his breath fogging though the heater blasted. The children sat rigid, their hands folded in their laps. They did not shiver. They did not blink. "Where are your parents?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. The boy turned his head slowly, his black eyes locking onto Michael's. "They'll find us soon," he whispered. Michael gripped the wheel tighter. He had driven through blizzards, past avalanches, even once with a grizzly chasing his truck. But nothing had ever made him feel fear like this. The girl leaned forward, her cold breath brushing his neck. "You should let us drive," she said softly. Michael nearly slammed on the brakes. "What did you say?" "You should let us drive," she repeated, her voice suddenly deeper, layered, as though more than one person spoke through her. The escape. Michael pulled the truck to the shoulder, heart pounding. "Out," he ordered, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Both of you, out." The children didn't move. Instead, they turned their heads toward him in unison, their faces inches from his. Their eyes seemed darker than before, pulling at him as though drawing him in. For a moment, Michael felt himself slipping, his will draining away. A whisper filled his head, a chorus of voices urging him to give up control, to let them in. With a roar, he shoved the door open and leapt into the snow. The cold bit into his skin, but it broke the trance. He stumbled around the truck, yanking the passenger door wide, only to find the seats empty. The children were gone. Michael spun in the freezing wind, searching the road, the tree line, the ditch. Nothing. No footprints in the snow, no figures fading into the distance. They had simply vanished. The aftermath. Shaking, Michael climbed back into his truck and locked the doors. He drove straight through the night, not daring to stop until he reached a gas station hours later. When he told the attendant what he'd seen, the man's face went pale. "You picked them up, didn't you?" he whispered. "The black-eyed kids. People see them out here sometimes. They say if you let them into your home or your vehicle, you're never the same again. Michael didn't argue. He didn't tell anyone else what happened. But from that night on, he avoided night drives whenever possible. And when he had no choice, he never stopped for anyone. Because in the Yukon, some children are not children at all. Michael Harding's encounter on the Alaska highway was not the last. For decades, stories of the black-eyed children drifted through Yukon towns like smoke, dismissed by some as myths, whispered by others as warnings. But for one family, the horror was not just a tale. It was a night they would never escape. The isolated family. In 2004, Daniel and Marissa Johnson moved with their 2 children to a cabin near Watson Lake. They wanted peace, away from the noise of the cities, and the Yukon offered exactly that: quiet, beauty, and space to raise their kids. By December, snow sealed them into a world of white silence. Nights were long, and the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. But they felt safe. The woods had always been their friend. Until one night, when a knock came at the door. The knock at midnight. It was just after midnight. Daniel was awake, reading by the fire, when he heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. At first, he thought it was a wind, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Marissa stirred. Who could be out here at this hour? Daniel frowned. No one should be. He opened the door a crack, cold air rushing in. 2 children stood on the porch. A boy and a girl, pale, thin, dressed in light clothing unsuited for the snow. "Our parents will be here soon," the boy said softly. "Can we come inside?" Daniel's skin prickled. Something in their voices was wrong. Too calm, too flat, but they looked helpless, freezing. Against his instincts, he stepped aside. The children enter. The moment the children crossed the threshold, the air in the cabin changed. It grew colder, heavier, as though a storm had settled inside. Marissa gasped when she saw their eyes. Black, entirely black, swallowing the firelight. She whispered, "Daniel," but he shook his head, unsure of what to do. The children sat on the couch, hands folded neatly. "Thank you," the girl said. Her voice was polite, rehearsed. "We'll just wait here until our parents arrive." Their own children, Emily and Jack, peeked from the hallway, curious. Marissa rushed to block their view. Something deep in her gut screamed danger. The strange requests. Minutes dragged into hours. The children did not move, did not blink. They only watched. Finally, the boy spoke. "We're very thirsty. Do you have water?" Daniel poured them glasses. They did not drink. They only held the cups, staring at him with those endless black eyes. Then the girl whispered, "You should let us stay. Forever. It's warmer here." Marissa's blood ran cold. "No," she snapped. "You can't." The children turned their heads toward her in perfect unison. Their lips curled into the faintest smiles. "It isn't your choice," the boy said. The power goes out. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The fire sputtered, nearly extinguished. Darkness swallowed the cabin, broken only by the pale glow of the children's eyes. Emily screamed from the hallway. Jack cried out. Daniel grabbed his shotgun, aiming it at the figures on the couch. "Out!" he demanded. "Get out of my house." The children rose slowly, their movements unnaturally smooth, puppet-like. "We only wanted to be let in." the girl said. Now we are. They took a step forward, and Daniel fired. The blast lit the room for a split second, and when the smoke cleared, the children were gone. The vanishing. The front door stood wide open, snow swirling inside. Daniel rushed out into the night, heart hammering. No tracks marked the snow. No figures fled into the trees. The yard was empty, untouched. Inside, Marissa clutched their children, rocking them as they sobbed. What were they? She whispered. Daniel had no answer. He only knew one thing. They had invited something into their home, and it had left not because of his gun, but because it wanted to. The aftermath. For weeks, the family lived in fear. At night, they heard knocks at the door, always 3, always soft. Sometimes they heard voices outside, Emily's voice, Jack's voice, pleading to be let in, even while the real children slept safely in their beds. They stopped answering. They boarded the windows, nailed the doors shut, but the knocks continued. By spring, the family fled the cabin, abandoning it with most of their belongings inside. Locals who later explored the place reported finding strange symbols carved into the wood, spirals and circles around the windows and doors. And in the ashes of the long-dead fireplace, 2 child-sized handprints pressed into the stone, blackened, burned deep as though seared by fire. The Johnson family's flight from their cabin should have been the end of the story, another cautionary tale buried in Yukon folklore. But the black-eyed children are not tied to a single home or a single family. They wander the highways, the forests, and the frozen towns, always seeking one thing, an invitation. In 2011, a veteran police officer named Mark Fletcher encountered them during one of the worst snowstorms of the decade and lived to tell the tale. The blizzard call. Officer Fletcher was on patrol near Teslin when the storm hit. White-oak conditions, winds howling like banshees, visibility reduced to a few feet. He considered pulling over, but a call came through the radio, a stranded motorist a few miles up the highway. Reluctantly, he pressed on. Duty demanded it. The storm swallowed the world. His headlights barely cut through the swirling snow, the road a suggestion more than a path. Finally, he saw it, a car half buried in a drift, hazard lights blinking weakly. He pulled up behind it, grabbed his flashlight, and trudged through the snow. That was when he saw them, the children by the car. 2 figures stood beside the stranded vehicle. Children, no more than 12. They were pale, underdressed for the cold, their thin clothing whipping in the wind. Fletcher's first thought was confusion. Where were their parents? Then unease settled in as he noticed the way they stood, perfectly still, side by side, staring straight at him. He raised his light. Their eyes reflected back solid black. The boy stepped forward. His voice carried clearly through the gale. "Officer, we're so cold. Please, let us sit in your car." Fletcher froze. Training told him to help. Instinct told him to run. The invitation game. The girl tilted her head, her black eyes gleaming. "We can't get in unless you say so," she said softly. "Please invite us." The words slithered through Fletcher's mind like smoke. His lips parted before he realized he was speaking. "Sure, come." But then he stopped. A voice inside, primal and panicked, screamed, "Don't say it. Don't let them in." He swallowed the words. "Stay where you are," he barked, forcing authority into his tone. "Where are your parents?" The children smiled in unison. "Closer than you think," the boy said. "Behind them," The car's hazard lights flickered, and for a split second, Fletcher saw faces press against the frosted windows. Not children's faces. Something else. Twisted, stretched, watching. The attack. The children stepped closer. Fletcher raised his flashlight like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted. The girl whispered, "It's warmer in your car, officer. We just want to sit. Please let us in." Her voice was laid deep and wrong, vibrating through the storm. Fletcher felt his knees buckle, his mind fogging. He nearly dropped the light. Then, through the gale, his radio crackled. Dispatch's voice cut through the trance. "Fletcher, status check. Do you copy?" The sound snapped him back. He stumbled to his cruiser, fumbling the door open, slamming it shut behind him. The children were at the window instantly, their black eyes inches from the glass, tapping softly with their fingernails. "Invite us in," they whispered together. "Invite us." The flight. Fletcher floored the accelerator. The cruiser fishtailed, snow spraying, but he didn't stop. The figures clung to the windows for a moment before vanishing into the storm. For miles, he drove blindly, heart racing. Every so often, he thought he saw them in the headlights, two pale shapes at the roadside, always watching. Finally, he burst through the edge of the storm into a clearing. The road was empty. The children were gone, but the sense of being watched never left. The aftermath. Back at the station, Fletcher filed his report. He left out the details of the eyes, the whispers, the faces in the car. Who would believe him? But that night, as he tried to sleep, a knock came at his front door. 3 soft raps. He didn't answer. The next night, it came again. Knock, knock, knock. And sometimes, through the wood, he swears he hears a child's voice. "Please, officer, let us in." The legend grows. To this day, truckers, hunters, and travelers across the Yukon whisper of the black-eyed children. They warn newcomers. If you hear knocking at night, do not answer. If you see children by the roadside, do not stop. And above all, never, ever invite them in. Because once you do, they will never leave. And in the endless cold of the Yukon, where night stretched forever and silence is absolute, their whispers carry still. Please, let us in. For most people, the northern lights are a dream, a breathtaking dance of color across the Arctic sky. Travelers flock from around the world to stand in the Yukon wilderness and watch curtains of green, purple, and blue ripple like fire. But to the indigenous peoples of the far north, the lights are not just a natural wonder. They are alive, they are watching, and sometimes they reach down from the heavens to take what they want. The old warnings. For centuries, the First Nations of the Yukon warned children never to whistle at the aurora. To do so was to invite the spirits closer. Elders whispered that the lights were not just colors but souls of the dead, swirling across the sky. If you respected them, they would pass in silence. But if you mocked them, whistled at them, or called them down, they would answer, and their answer would not be kind. Most outsiders dismissed these tales as folklore, until, in 1978, a group of young hunters learned the truth the hard way. The hunter's trip. That winter, 5 teenage boys from Dawson City decided to test the old warnings. They had grown up hearing the stories, but like most kids, they thought them superstitions. One weekend, they set off into the wilderness to camp beneath the northern lights. Their goal wasn't hunting, it was to challenge the spirits. The aurora appeared the second night, blazing across the heavens in a wash of green fire. The boys stared in awe at first, the colors painting their faces. Then one of them, Tommy, cupped his hands and whistled up at the sky. The others laughed and joined in, their whistles cutting sharp through the frozen air. The aurora seemed to shiver in response. The lights answer. At first, they thought it was coincidence. The green ribbon shifted suddenly, snapping downward, twisting as though reaching toward them. "Look!" Tommy shouted. "They're coming down." Excitement replaced fear. They kept whistling, louder now, daring the sky to come closer. Then, without warning, a sound split the silence. A howl, not from any wolf, not from any wind. It was high-pitched, shrieking, human-like but not human at all. The boys froze. Their laughter died. The lights above swirled violently, coils of green fire whipping lower, closer, until they seemed to brush the tops of the trees. And in those coils, faces began to appear. The faces in the sky. They were faint at first, shadows in the ribbons. But as the aurora thickened, the faces grew clearer. Dozens, then hundreds. Men, women, children, all with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their features twisting in agony. The boys backed toward their campfire, the heat suddenly useless against the cold that pressed in. The howling grew louder, filling the forest, echoing from all sides. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus, hundreds screaming in unison, carried on the lights themselves. And then the lights reached down. The attack, a column of green fire slammed into the snow in front of them. It writhed like a living thing, curling toward Tommy. His body stiffened, his face slack with terror as the light wrapped around him. The others screamed, grabbing for him, but their hands passed straight through. His body began to lift from the ground, pulled upward by the aurora itself. "Help me!" he shrieked. "Don't let them!" His voice was cut off as the light yanked him skyward. He rose, screaming, his body twisting, until he vanished into the ribbons above. The others fled, the survivors. Hours later, 3 of the boys staggered into Dawson, frostbitten, terrified, barely able to speak. They claimed the lights had taken Tommy. Search parties scoured the woods for days, but no trace was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. Locals whispered otherwise. The elders only shook their heads. He whistled. One old woman said simply, "The lights heard him." The return of the lights. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, one of the surviving boys, Aaron, claimed he saw Tommy again. Not in Dawson, not on Earth. He was staring out from the aurora itself. His face stretched in horror, his mouth open in a soundless scream as the green fire writhed overhead. The lights pulsed when Aaron whispered his name, as though answering. Then the face dissolved back into the ribbons, leaving him sobbing in the snow. The legend grows. Since that winter, others have reported similar horrors. Travelers see faces in the sky, hear howling when no wind blows, feel invisible hands brushing their skin beneath the lights. Some claim the aurora hunts for those who mock it. Others say it simply hungers, feeding on souls to keep itself alive. But all agree on one rule: never whistle at the northern lights. Because if you do, they might just whistle back. The hunter's tale of Tommy's disappearance became a whispered warning in Dawson, but most outsiders never heard it. Tourists still flocked north to witness the aurora, eager for photos and stories to share back home. For many, the lights were just beauty. But for one family in 1992, the aurora was not beautiful. It was predatory. The camping trip. Paul and Denise Miller had 2 children, Ryan and Lily. They were from Alberta and had always dreamed of seeing the northern lights in their full glory. In February of 1992, they drove deep into the Yukon, parking their camper in a clearing far from the city's glow. The sky was clear, the stars sharp as knives. Cold, yes, but they had brought thick coats and blankets. The children laughed, running through the snow while Paul set up a small fire. Then the lights appeared. They began as a faint shimmer, then grew into long curtains of green and violet, twisting across the heavens. Denise gasped, tears in her eyes. "It's more beautiful than I ever imagined." But as the ribbons grew brighter, the air shifted. The night grew too quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. And then the howling began. The howl returns. At first, Paul thought it was wolves. But the sound was wrong. Higher, sharper, layered with dozens of tones, as if 100 voices screamed in unison. The children froze, staring upward. "Daddy," Lily whispered, "the lights are making the noise." Paul followed her gaze. His stomach twisted. The ribbons above were moving unnaturally, writhing like serpents. Faces flickered within them, distorted, agonized faces, mouths open in endless cries. Ryan covered his ears, sobbing. "Make it stop." The howling grew louder, pressing into their skulls, vibrating through the ground itself. The lights descend. Suddenly, a column of light plunged into the clearing, slamming into the snow like lightning. The fire died instantly, leaving only the unnatural glow. The column twisted, reaching for Lily. She screamed as her body lifted several inches off the ground, her hair rising, her eyes wide with terror. Paul rushed forward, grabbing her legs. "No, you can't have her." He pulled with all his strength, but the light coiled tighter, pulling upward. Lily's body stretched unnaturally, her scream warping into something inhuman. Denise clutched Ryan, shielding his eyes. "Paul!" she shrieked, with a roar. Paul yanked Lily free, tumbling backward into the snow. The column recoiled, shivering like a wounded animal, then lashed out again. The flight! Paul didn't hesitate. "Into the camper!" he bellowed. The family scrambled inside, slamming the door. The interior glowed green as ribbons of light wrapped around the vehicle, shaking it violently. Ryan cried hysterically while Denise clutched him close, whispering prayers. The howling filled the camper, vibrating through the walls, through their bones. The faces pressed against the windows, not physically, but made of light itself, mouths open, black eyes wide. Lily whispered, "They want me. They almost took me." Paul gritted his teeth, starting the engine. The camper roared, tires spinning before finding grip. He floored the accelerator, crashing through the snowbank, speeding into the dark forest road. Behind them, the lights followed. The chase. The aurora twisted low across the treetops, ribbons snaking through the branches. They whipped down, slamming into the ground ahead, forcing Paul to swerve wildly. The road curved sharply, snow spraying as the camper nearly tipped. Still, the lights followed, howling louder, faces flickering in the glow. "Faster!" Denise screamed. Paul's knuckles were white on the wheel. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get them away. Suddenly, the road dipped into a valley. The camper plunged downward, the lights momentarily losing their grip. Paul pushed harder, the vehicle rattling as though it might fall apart. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the howling stopped. The silence after. The lights retreated into the sky, swirling peacefully as though nothing had happened. The Millers finally stopped at a roadside pullout, the children trembling, Denise sobbing into her hands. Paul stepped out, staring at the heavens. The aurora rippled gently above, serene and beautiful, no trace of the nightmare that had hunted them. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the howling. And when Lily slept that night, she whispered in her dreams, "They are not done. They'll come back for me." The aftermath. The Millers cut their trip short, driving home the next day without speaking of what had happened. Years later, when Lily was grown, she admitted to her mother that she sometimes still saw faces in the aurora. Sometimes, she even heard them whisper her name. By the 2000s, the Yukon had become a hotspot for tourists eager to capture the perfect photo of the Northern Lights. Dozens of guided tours set out nightly, vans of visitors heading into the wilderness, armed with cameras and tripods. For most, the experience was magical. But in 2008, one tour ended in a tragedy that has never been officially explained. The guide, her name was Sarah Hale, a 34-year-old who had lived her entire life in the Yukon. She had seen the lights hundreds of times, knew every legend, every warning. But she didn't believe them. On a clear January night, she drove a group of 10 tourists into backcountry. They were bundled in parkas, eager for a show. Sarah parked the van in a wide-open clearing where the aurora often appeared brightest. And that night, it did not disappoint. The sky erupted in cascades of green and purple, ribbons of light pulsing and twisting. The tourists gasped, cameras clicking, laughter echoing in the cold air. But then, someone whistled. The first whistle. Sarah whipped around. "Don't do that," she said sharply. A young man laughed. "Relax, it's just a sound." But Sarah's stomach tightened. The elders had warned her as a child, never whistle at the lights. She shook it off, telling herself it was just superstition. Still, unease prickled the back of her neck. Minutes later, another whistle pierced the night. This time, the aurora seemed to respond. The ribbons above shimmered violently, twisting into jagged shapes. The laughter died. One of the tourists pointed upward, her face pale. "Do you see that?" The lights were forming faces. The howling begins. At first, faint outlines, then clearer, sharper, men and women, their mouths open, black pits where eyes should be. And then the howling began. It started as a low moan, then rose into a shriek, 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The tourists clutched their ears, some dropping to their knees. The sound seemed to come from inside their skulls, vibrating through their bones. Sarah shouted for everyone to get back in the van. Panic erupted. The group scrambled, stumbling through the snow, but the lights were already descending. The lights attacked. Columns of green fire slammed into the clearing, circling the group. The snow hissed and melted where the light touched. Faces swirled within the ribbons, their mouths moving in silent words. One tourist, a woman in her 40s, screamed as a column wrapped around her. Her body stiffened, her arms flailing. The others grabbed for her, but the light lifted her from the ground, pulling her skyward. Her scream cut off as she vanished into the aurora. The group scattered, terror driving them in every direction. The vanishing. Sarah fought her way to the van, wrenching the door open. "Get in," she screamed. A handful of tourists dove inside, slamming the doors shut, but 4 others didn't make it. Through the windshield, Sarah saw them running across the clearing and saw the light snatch them one by one. Each was lifted into the sky, swallowed by the ribbons, their faces contorted in terror before they disappeared. The howling grew deafening, rattling the van, shattering one of the windows. Green light poured inside, wrapping around the seats. Sarah floored the accelerator. The van roared, tires skidding before catching on the icy ground. She sped down the narrow trail, the Aurora riding overhead, chasing them. The survivors. Hours later, Sarah and 6 tourists staggered into Whitehall's, frostbitten, hysterical. They told police what had happened, but their accounts were dismissed as shock and hallucination. Rescue teams searched the clearing. No bodies were ever found. No tracks led away. It was as though the missing had simply evaporated. But Sarah knew the truth. She had seen them taken. The aftermath. Sarah never guided another tour. She left the Yukon entirely, moving south to Vancouver, where the skies never glowed with fire. In interviews, she refused to give details, only saying, "They're not lights. They're alive, and they're hungry." To this day, the disappearance remains unsolved, but locals whisper about it whenever the aurora is bright and the air grows too still. The legend lives on. Today, the story is repeated to tourists as a warning. Some laugh, some even whistle at the sky, daring the lights to answer. But others, especially those who grew up under the endless northern nights, keep their eyes down and their mouths shut, because they know the truth. The lights don't just dance. They don't just shimmer. Sometimes the northern lights howl, and when they howl, they take. Deep in the Alaskan wilderness lies the abandoned mining town of Kennecott, once one of the richest copper sites in the world. In the early 1900s, men flocked to its towering mills, working day and night to strip the earth of its blood-red ore. But wealth came with a price. Accidents, cave-ins, mysterious disappearances. By the time the mines were abandoned in the 1930s, the town had earned a reputation, not just for riches, but for curses, the prosperity and the deaths. When the mine first opened in 1911, workers called it the mountain that bled. Rich veins of copper glowed in the rock, fueling the boom that built the mill town below. But almost immediately, accident began. Tools snapped, carts derailed, tunnels collapsed without warning. Some miners swore the mountain didn't want to be emptied. Others claimed to see shapes moving in the darkness, figures with glowing red eyes watching from the deepest shafts. One man, a veteran miner named William Harlan, swore he heard voices whispering his name whenever he went below ground. His co-workers laughed until he vanished during a shift. His body was never found. The tunnel that shouldn't exist. In 1916, a group of miners broke through a wall of rock into a tunnel that wasn't on any map. The passage sloped downward, its walls unnaturally smooth, as though carved by hands long before the mine was built. Inside, they found strange markings etched into the stone, circles, spirals, jagged shapes that seemed to pulse in the lamplight. Spooked, the men reported their find. The foreman sealed the passage, ordering everyone to stay out. But whispers spread that the tunnel wasn't natural, that it was older than the mine itself, and that whatever lived inside hadn't been disturbed for a very long time. The night of the collapse. A year later, disaster struck. At midnight, a rumble shook the earth. One of the deepest shafts caved in, trapping 30 men inside. Rescue crews worked frantically for days, But the deeper they dug, the stranger things became. Voices echoed from the rubble, voices of the trapped miners. But when rescuers broke through, no bodies were found. The voices continued for hours afterward, drifting up from the sealed tunnels, begging for help. Then they stopped. When the debris was finally cleared, the shaft was empty. Not a single trace of the 30 men remained. The survivors speak. A handful of miners quit immediately, swearing the mountain was cursed. One, a man named Carlos Mendez, told a chilling story before he left. He claimed that during the collapse, he saw figures moving in the dark tunnels, tall, shadowy shapes with glowing copper eyes. They didn't dig, didn't help. They only watched as the rock swallowed the miners alive. When Carlos ran, he heard them whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The sound followed him all the way to the surface. The company dismissed him as delirious, but others believed. The abandonment. By the 1930s, the copper was gone, and so was the town. Kennecott became a ghost, its giant mill buildings standing like skeletons against the mountains. But those who ventured back told unsettling stories. Lanterns flickering in empty shafts. Voices calling from the tunnels. Strange symbols carved deeper into the walls than any miner had ever worked. Some said the 30 missing men were still down there, not dead but changed, their souls bound to the mountain that had swallowed them. Others said something older had simply claimed them. The legend grows. Today, Kennecott is a tourist site. Visitors hike through its decaying buildings, snapping photos, marveling at the history. Few dare to enter the tunnels. But those who do sometimes return pale, shaken, unable to speak of what they saw. A few don't return at all. The locals still whisper warnings. The mines are not empty. The mountain remembers. And those who disturb it may hear the voices of the lost calling from the dark. By the 1980s, Kennecott had become a ghost town with a haunting beauty. Photographers, hikers, and thrill-seekers wandered through decaying buildings, climbing the skeletal remains of the mill. Most stuck to the surface. Few dared the tunnels. But in 1986, a group of amateur explorers decided to push deeper. Their names were never released publicly, but their story survives in fragments, shared by the only survivor. The descent. The group of 5 men entered the mine on a gray November morning. The air was icy, the wood beams rotting, the tunnels groaning with age. They carried flashlights, ropes, and cameras, eager to capture what lay beneath. At first, it was simple exploration. Old cart tracks, rusted tools, collapsed shafts, dust and silence. But then they found the sealed passage. The wooden boards blocking it were ancient, carved with strange markings. Circles, spirals, jagged lines, almost identical to the ones the miners had reported 70 years earlier. The men laughed nervously, pried the boards loose, and slipped inside. The forbidden tunnel. The passage sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. Their lights flickered against smooth stone walls etched with symbols, some glowing faintly as though alive. The tunnel felt wrong. Too narrow, too deliberate. Not the work of miners, but something older. One man joked about ancient spirits. Another muttered that it smelled like copper and blood. The deeper they went, the louder the whispers became. At first, faint echoes, like wind, but soon the voices grew distinct, pleading, begging, "Help us, help us." The men froze. Those were the voices of the 30 miners who had vanished in 1917. The first sign of horror. One of the explorers, Jerry, raised his camera. "We have to record this," he said. He snapped a photo, the flash filling the tunnel. When the light faded, he was gone. The others shouted his name, sweeping the beam of their flashlights across the walls. Nothing. No trace. No sound. Just empty stone. And then, faintly, Jerry's voice echoed from deeper within. "Guys, where are you?" But it sounded wrong. Hollow, stretched, as if spoken from a great distance, or from inside the rock itself. The things in the dark. Panic set in. The 4 remaining men turned back, but the tunnel behind them had changed. The smooth walls now twisted, the symbols shifting, glowing brighter. And in the glow, figures began to appear. Tall, thin, with eyes burning like molten copper. Their shapes were human, but elongated, bent at impossible angles. They stood motionless at first, watching. Then they stepped forward, their limbs scraping the stone. The men ran. The pursuit. The tunnel stretched endlessly, no longer matching the way they had come. The whispers grew deafening, dozens of voices, crying, pleading, mocking. One by one, the explorers vanished. A hand brushing against stone, a scream, and then silence. No struggle, no trace. Just gone. Finally, only one man remained, the survivor who would later tell the story. He stumbled through the twisting passage, lungs burning, until he burst into a shaft lit by faint daylight. He climbed toward it desperately, tearing his hands on jagged rock. Behind him, whispers rose into a roar, and for a moment, he swore he felt copper eyes burning into his back. But he made it. He crawled out of the shaft, collapsing in the snow. When he looked back, the entrance was gone, sealed with solid stone, as if it had never existed. The survivor's tale. Weeks later, he told authorities what happened. They dismissed him as traumatized, his friends listed as missing hikers. But locals whispered that he had seen the cursed tunnel, the one never meant to be opened. And they warned that Kennecott's mines are not just abandoned. They are alive. Every few years, hikers vanish in those hills. Search teams find nothing. No tracks, no bodies. Just silence. Some say the mountain still hungers. Others say the missing 30 miners never left. By the early 2000s, Kennecott had become a destination not only for hikers and history buffs, but for paranormal investigators. Ghost hunters with cameras, recorders, and electromagnetic sensors roamed the rotting buildings, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural. Most found nothing but creaks and shadows. But in 2003, a small team of 3 investigators entered the mines. What they recorded was so disturbing that 2 of them never returned to sight again. The first night, the team, Alex, Dana, and Chris, arrived in July. The sun barely dipped below the horizon, leaving the nights a dim twilight glow. Perfect for filming. Armed with cameras and recorders, they ventured into one of the shafts just before midnight. The air inside was damp and metallic, the walls groaning with age. Almost immediately, their equipment picked up EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, faint whispers on the static, words just beyond comprehension. When Dana boosted the audio later, the words were chillingly clear. Still here, still waiting. The voices grow stronger. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Flashlights flickered, batteries drained in seconds, cameras shut off without warning, and the whispers grew louder, not just through the recorders, but in their ears as though someone stood behind them, speaking into the dark. Alex swore he felt fingers brush his neck. Dana screamed when she saw a face reflected in a pane of broken glass, her own, but distorted, eyes glowing copper. Chris wanted to turn back, but Alex pushed forward. He was obsessed with finding the sealed tunnel the legend spoke of, the discovery. After hours of wandering, they found it, a wall of stone that looked too smooth, too deliberate. Strange markings were etched deep into the surface. Circles, spirals, jagged lines that pulsed faintly in their flashlight beams. Alex placed his hand on the stone. It was warm. Then the rock shuddered and split open, revealing a narrow passage. Against Chris's protest, Alex and Dana stepped inside. Chris, terrified, stayed behind, filming from the shaft. What happened next was captured on both his camera and the audio recorder. The attack. Inside the passage, Alex and Dana gasped. "Oh my God," Dana whispered. "There are people." Figures stood in the tunnel, motionless, their eyes glowing copper. They were tall, thin, distorted, and they whispered in dozens of voices at once. Chris, watching from outside, saw his friends lift their cameras, and then the tunnel erupted in light. Alex screamed first, a horrible, tearing sound. His body convulsed, lifting into the air as if pulled by invisible strings. Dana shrieked, trying to run, but the light wrapped around her, twisting her limbs at impossible angles. Their screams echoed, overlapping, until they became whispers, dozens of whispers, then silence. When the light faded, the tunnel was empty. The escape. Chris ran. He dropped his camera, stumbling through the shafts, chased by voices that weren't quite human. He burst into the night, sobbing, his clothes scorched as if burned by fire. Locals found him hours later, wondering in shock. He refused to speak of what he'd seen for months. When he finally did, his story was so horrifying that many dismissed it as hallucination. But the audio recorder told a different tale. The recording. On the tape, the voices are faint at first. Whispers, please, cries, then clear as day. Join us. We are waiting. And then Alex's scream, Dana's scream, the roar of something vast and inhuman. Finally, silence, followed by dozens of voices chanting in unison, whispering names. Not just Alex and Dana, but Chris, and the names of 30 miners who had vanished in 1917. The aftermath. Chris never returned to Kennecott. He moved out of Alaska entirely, abandoning his footage and equipment. Some say he destroyed the tape. Others claim copies still circulate in secret, traded among paranormal groups as proof of what dwells beneath the mountain. But the legend only grew stronger. Visitors to Kennecott report hearing faint whispers near the old shafts. Some swear their names are called. A few claim to see figures watching from the shadows, tall, thin, with copper eyes. The curse lives on. Today, the ruins of Kennecott still stand, a relic of Alaska's mining boom. Tourists wander through, marveling at its history, laughing at the ghost stories. But locals know better. They warn against the tunnels, against a sealed passage that never stays sealed. Because the mountain is alive. The miners are still down there. And the curse of Kennecott has never died. The dread never sleeps. Subscribe to Hidden Dread.